All right, so we've learned a little bit about the demand curve and marginal revenue for a monopolist. Now let's look at what profit maximization looks like for a monopolist. And one of the things we need to do as we go forward is to recognize that there are really two different flavors of monopoly. There's the usual monopoly that we think of. It's just a firm that happens to own its market, to be the only firm in the market, and prices as a profit maximizer. The second type of monopoly is what we call a natural monopoly. And I think what we'll do is leave that for the third segment on this chapter, and we'll talk about natural monopoly there. But for now, we're just talking about a monopoly that, how's it come about? Well, if you have a great idea for a new product, and you bring it to market, and you're the only one who has that, and you're the only one who can have it, you will have a monopoly. So what do you need to do to protect your monopoly, to make sure that you're the only one in the market? Well, what do? Maybe you patent the product that you're making or a process used in making that product. Maybe you make sure that you own all of the resources necessary for producing that product. What else could you do? You could try to lobby for the existence or the creation of a law that makes it illegal for anybody else to make the product. So you think about that. Essentially, that's what patents are, is the creation of a legal permission keeping anybody else from making a product for a period of time. And so firms that have monopolies want to protect them. The question is, why do they want to protect them? And the reason we're going to see is that they tend to be profitable in the long run. So let's think about what a monopoly would look like as it goes about the process of maximizing profit. So, profit maximization for a monopoly is what we want to talk about. And so we'll go back to where we were previously. We have a monopolist, and that monopolist has a demand curve, which happens to be the market demand. And marginal revenue looks like that. One thing just to note about this before I forget, let's just write down the equation of this demand curve. So suppose this demand curve, and actually this is an inverse demand, so I'll write an inverse demand curve. Let's just say price is A minus BQ. That's this demand curve. Okay, so it's just a linear inverse demand. And we might want to figure out how then we draw the inverse or the marginal revenue. So remember that total revenue equals price times quantity. So that means that it's going to be A minus BQ, price, times quantity. So total revenue is AQ minus BQ squared. Marginal revenue is the derivative of that with respect to quantity. And so marginal revenue turns out to be A minus 2BQ. Well, that's interesting. The price is A minus BQ. That's the inverse demand curve. And marginal revenue is A minus 2BQ. And this turns out to be a standard result when we have linear demand curves, which is that the marginal revenue has the same intercept, but it's twice as steep. So if the slope of this is minus B, the slope of the marginal revenue is minus 2B. And as long as we have linear demand, which is what we'll really stick with throughout this course, then for a monopolist, the marginal revenue is just going to be twice as steep. Okay. go to a clean picture since I messed that one up. So we have demand and marginal revenue. And what we would expect is that we're going to have some sort of an average total cost curve and some sort of a marginal cost curve. I haven't put average variable cost in here. We could talk about monopoly. Remember that in competitive firm, the difference between short run and long run is essentially the existence of a difference between average variable cost and total cost. That is, the existence of fixed costs. In competition, we really care about that difference because there are no barriers to entry. And if the firm is earning economic profits, new firms will come in. And we need to be able to figure out when it's worth that firm's while to stay in business, when it's going to shut down, etc. In the case of a monopoly like this one, if this firm is making profit in the short run, what happens? It continues making profit. And that's about it. If this firm has a monopoly and has a way to protect it, to keep new firms from entering, it'll continue to make profits well into the long run. And so we don't really need to make a distinction between the long run and the short run. And typically, we won't even include the average variable cost curve when we draw this. All right. So this is a firm with its cost curves. And the question is, how much should it produce? And the answer is, it should produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's always the answer. Okay. And so this gives us the optimal quantity for the firm to produce. How much should it charge? Well, the demand curve says if you want to sell this quantity, the highest price you can charge and be able to sell that quantity is given by the demand curve. And so this is the equilibrium price for a monopolist. How's the monopolist doing in this situation? Well, P star times Q star, this entire rectangle represents the firm's total revenue. We take Q star up to average total cost and across. This lower box gives us the firm's total cost, right? That's the average cost times quantity is total cost. And this area then, the area above total cost and below the price, this is the firm's economic profit. And like I said, this is what happens in the short run, and we expect the firm also to be able to maintain that profitability in the long run. So question, does this mean that monopolies are always profitable? And the answer is no, it doesn't mean that. So there's a tendency to, when you think about monopoly, to say, well, the monopoly can charge any price they want. But you can see that really what they're doing is they're charging the profit maximizing price. Could they charge a higher price? Could they charge a price up here? Yeah, but it's not going to serve the firm well. If their objective is to maximize profit, they want to be right where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So they have the freedom to set price, but they really are constrained by this demand. And if there's not sufficient demand for the product, having a monopoly doesn't mean they're going to be profitable, right? So if I always think that if you think about a product that is no longer particularly useful, buggy whips are a good example. If you don't know what a buggy whip is, people used to drive around in buggies pulled by a horse, and in order to get the horse to move, you had to have a whip, and you would hit the horse with the whip, and the horse would move. All right, well, you could start making buggy whips and you'd have a monopoly. You'd be the only producer of buggy whips around. How profitable would you be? Probably not very, because the demand for that product is not very robust at this point. Okay. All right. What can we say about that monopoly equilibrium? Well, let's go back and think about this market for a second. So here we have market demand, marginal revenue, those belong to the firm. And let's just put in the marginal cost. If this firm is a monopoly, it's going to produce this quantity, and to maximize profit, it will want to charge this price. Question we might ask is, if instead of being a monopoly, if this market were actually competitive, if there were many firms in this market selling this product, where would the equilibrium be? So let's call this the monopoly price and the monopoly quantity. If this were a competitive market, where would we expect the market to be, the price and the quantity? Well, what we know is that in a competitive market, marginal cost is a approximation of the firm's supply curve. So if this were the market supply and this is the market demand, then in a competitive market, we would expect the equilibrium quantity to be something like this and the equilibrium price to be here. In a competitive market, then, we expect lower price for consumers and a larger quantity. What else can we say about this? Well, when this is a competitive market, this area right here is consumer surplus, and this area above the supply curve and beneath price is producer surplus. When the market is a monopoly, all of this, we have another color, I have a little purple here. This entire area in monopoly, that entire area is lost. And this then is the deadweight loss of monopoly. That is the cost to society of having a monopoly do its pricing rather than a competitive market. In a competitive market, society would benefit from having a greater quantity produced at a lower price. And so we often think that monopoly is a form of market failure. What is a market failure? Well, a market failure is when a market fails to produce the socially optimal quantity at a socially optimal price. We've seen before that things like price floors and price ceilings can create deadweight loss. The taxes and subsidies can create deadweight loss. But the market itself, even when left on its own, can create market failures. And one market failure comes from when there's a lack of competition in a market, and that market is dominated by a single firm. If you look around the United States today, well, maybe a couple of days ago, when our economy was operating normally, which it hopefully will be again soon, you see a number of firms that really dominate their markets. And there's been a lot of concern in recent years about the consequences of market power, of few firms dominating their industries. When you think about Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and you think about, or Comcast, you think about the way that these firms price their products, you have to believe that if they were in more competitive markets, the pricing would be quite different. And they'd have to act more like competitive firms if they in fact had some competition. And that's a concern. And so the arguments that people make that you just have to let the market operate freely kind of ignores the consequence of having a market that operates freely without competition. And that's what the story of monopoly is. All right, I'll stop there and come back and we'll talk about natural monopoly.